Welcome to Bullion Signal. Our whole mission here is to help you find the signal in the noise of global finance. If that sounds like what you're looking for, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. All right, let's get right into it. Let's start with a number that just doesn't make any sense. Right now, the US is running a fiscal deficit of somewhere between 6 and 7% of its entire economy. Now, you'd expect to see a number like that during a massive recession or, a world war, but it's happening during peacetime with what they're telling us is full employment. This is, it's completely unprecedented. A number like this is a warning sign. It's the system screaming that it's under stress, way before the real trouble starts. And yet, despite that bright red warning light on the fiscal dashboard, this quote nails what's actually happening in financial markets. It's like they're living in a different reality. And that's the core of what we're talking about today. This huge, gaping disconnect. You have geopolitical reality on one side and this Goldilocks fantasy priced into stocks on the other. Our job is to bridge that gap, because understanding why the market is hallucinating is absolutely critical to protecting your capital. So first, we've got to peel back this illusion of calm. You look at the markets and you see what looks like stability, but it isn't a sign of strength. It's actually a measure of just how badly the system is misreading these deep structural shifts that are happening right under our feet. So let's talk about the big myth that's keeping everyone so complacent. We're all kind of conditioned by movies, by history books, to wait for that one big moment. The assassination, the invasion, the starting pistol that kicks everything off. But that's just not how it works. That's a total misunderstanding of how huge systemic failures actually happen. They don't start with a bang. No, they start with a long, quiet process where the very foundations of peace get taken apart piece by piece. And that brings us to the key idea for today, what we're calling the synchronization machine. This isn't about one single event. It's a mechanism. It's the process where all these different seemingly random crises, they start to click together. They lock in and they become one single overwhelming global problem. This is the hidden pattern, the rhythm that comes before every major systemic breakdown in history. And let's be very clear, a synchronization phase is happening right now. For years, we've all been trained to think of Ukraine, the Middle East, the South China Sea as separate boxes, right? Isolated problems. Well, that's not just wrong anymore, it's dangerous. These conflicts are now actively feeding each other. They're sharing weapons, they're giving each other diplomatic cover, they're coordinating pressure. They're all merging into one giant interconnected web of instability. You know the saying, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes? Well, take a look at 1912, 1913. The world was just full of what investors at the time called background noise. You had wars in the Balkans, skirmishes in Africa, this naval arms race between Britain and Germany, massive unrest inside Russia. To a trader in London, these were all just separate headlines. But under the surface, the complex web of alliances was turning them into one single powder keg. They were synchronizing. In the past, you had these things, call them geopolitical fire breaks. They could contain a crisis and keep it from spreading. But today, those are gone. Back then, it was alliances. And today, it's our total global interconnectedness that acts like a massive transmission belt. It makes sure that a spark in one place doesn't just burn out. Oh no, it gets instantly sent to another part of the world, guaranteeing the fire just keeps spreading. So this really begs a critical question, doesn't it? If the transmission belts back in 1914 were things like telegraphs and train schedules, what are they today? Because the speed of that transmission is directly tied to the speed of escalation. Figuring out what these modern accelerants are is absolutely key to understanding just how fast things could really unravel. Today's transmission mechanism is instantaneous. It's the speed of light. A blockade in the Red Sea doesn't just slowly ripple through the global economy over months. No, it reprices shipping insurance in London in real time, and it spikes inflation in the US within days. Shocks aren't transmitted at the speed of a steamship anymore. They're sent at the speed of fiber optics through our financial, digital, and industrial networks. Okay, so if synchronization is the how, what are the actual gears that are turning this machine? We can break it down into 4 distinct but deeply interconnected theaters of conflict, and they're all heating up at the same time. The key here is to stop looking at them as separate problems. They're actually one single coordinated stress test on the entire global system. The first theater is Europe. For 3 decades, Europe cashed in a peace dividend. They built these massive social welfare states by basically outsourcing their security to America. Well, that whole era came to a screeching halt in February of 2022. What we're watching now is this painful, slow, and incredibly costly pivot back to rearming. And that is a structural change that's going to have huge economic and social fallout. But here's the real problem. You can't just throw money at this. Money isn't ammunition. Decades of shipping their industry overseas means Europe simply can't produce the actual stuff of war. The shells, the tanks, you name it. And as governments have to choose between funding healthcare or funding defense, that social contract starts to tear. This creates political chaos that's just ripe for exploitation. Europe has gone from a global stabilizer to a net consumer of security. All right, theater number 2, the Middle East. And this one's all about controlling the jugular of the global economy. I'm talking about the world's most vital trade choke points. The conflict we're seeing escalate from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Red Sea. This is a direct fight for control over the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz. A massive chunk of all global trade and energy has to pass through there. And the strategy being used here is brutally effective. It's called asymmetric denial. You see how non-state groups, with the help of larger state sponsors, can effectively put a blockade on the West without ever actually declaring war. The cost to launch an attack is almost nothing compared to the cost to defend against it. It's a kind of economic warfare that's designed to be incredibly cheap for them and unbelievably expensive for us. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, the consequences are direct. When you weaponize these trade corridors, you force giant cargo ships to take the long way around Africa. That adds weeks to supply chains, and it adds real percentage points to global inflation. In effect, what they're doing is exporting economic pain directly into our households. They're influencing our economies and even our elections from thousands of miles away. Now for the third theater, Asia, which is really the center of gravity for this century. The situation with Taiwan gets simplified a lot. People just talk about an invasion. But the much more immediate threat is a quarantine or a blockade. And this specific pressure point is unique because it holds the entire global economy hostage through what you could call the Silicon Shield. Get this. Taiwan makes over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. So here's where the synchronization machine really kicks in. A crisis in Europe or the Middle East pulls US ships away from the Pacific, and that just widens the window of opportunity for a move against Taiwan. This has set off a frantic industrial race. Can the West build new chip factories at home before the East has the naval power to enforce a blockade? What do you think is the more likely outcome in that race? Drop a comment below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. The fourth theater is one that almost nobody is talking about, but it's crucial. Latin America. This area represents the return of great power politics, spheres of influence, right in the Western Hemisphere. What we're watching is a quiet but very aggressive scramble for all the strategic resources we need for the future. Lithium, copper, rare earth metals, the whole shebang. This is a massive strategic shift. For 200 years, the Monroe Doctrine basically kept other major powers out of the Americas. Well, that policy is now being openly challenged. We're seeing rival powers build ports and infrastructure that can be used for both commercial and military purposes. This completely removes the geographic safety bubble the US had in past world conflicts, forcing it to look over its own shoulder. How does this reemergence of spheres of influence change your view of global risk? Now, when you take these four theaters and you lay them on top of each other, a really terrifying picture starts to emerge. There is zero slack left in the system. None. A crisis blowing up in one part of the world doesn't mean you can just shift resources from somewhere else to deal with it, because all four zones are already flashing red at the same time. The reserves, whether military, economic, or diplomatic, are already stretched thin. What we're looking at is the textbook definition of overstretched. This is the classic historical pattern that comes right before the collapse of every great power. It's that impossible moment when the dominant power is forced into a corner and has to decide, which fires do we try to put out and which ones do we just have to let burn? That is the dangerous reality we're now facing, which of course brings us all the way back to that central, baffling question. If the geopolitical map is basically on fire, if the entire world is shifting toward conflict and fragmentation, why on earth are financial markets still priced for perfection, for peace, for efficiency, for more globalization? Why are assets valued as if none of this is happening? Answering that question is the key to everything. And that is the perfect place to pause for part one. The stage is officially set. We've established the how, the synchronization machine, and we've laid out the evidence across the four active theaters. The glaring disconnect between this reality and market prices should be crystal clear. In part two, we are going to dive deep into exactly how markets are mispricing this new world and give you a framework for what comes next. The growing Bullion Signal community is already getting ready for the shift, so make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss part two.